Okay, good evening and welcome to one and all. Pleasure to have you with us for this special event co-sponsored by the Jewish Center and the Jewish Communal Fund. Just wanted to start with a very brief thought. When Yitzchak blesses Yaakov in our Parsha, he starts with the words V'itein lecha ha'elokim, words we say every Saturday night. And of course, it means that Hashem should give you the following bracha. That's not what it says. It says v'yitain. It says Hashem, not Hashem should give you, but and Hashem should give you. Any second grade English teacher would correct this grammar. You don't start a sentence with the word and in the middle of nowhere. So Rashi says there's a hidden meaning here. Yitain v'yachzor b'yitain. The bracha is that the giving should be continuous. The bracha is that Hashem should give and give and give. And part of what it means to be a descendant of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, part of what it means to be a Jew is to be in a state of perpetually giving. It's not that we have a mitzvah called tzedakah and we check a box and we say we're done. It's actually the reason why there's no bracha on the mitzvah of tzedakah. You can make a bracha when you light Hanukkah candles because you light the candle and the mitzvah is over. So it's finite. You could say a bracha before because it has a beginning and an end. When it comes to tzedakah, there's no end to the mitzvah. The notion of charitable giving is a notion of being perpetually in motion. The idea is that we're never done. So it's a pleasure to partner with our friends at the Jewish Communal Fund to learn a little more about how we give and how we can do more with the funds that we are giving, and how we can do more good with our charitable giving in general. I want to thank Steve Graber and Michelle Leibowitz for helping conceptualize and plan this event. And the Jewish Communal Fund certainly doesn't need my endorsement, but I'm very proud to say that Rachel and I are current fund holders, and we couldn't be happier. Just say a word about each of our speakers, and then I'll turn things over to Amanda. And please note that the chat function is open. You can feel free to punch in your questions at any point over the course of the evening, and then we'll leave a little time at the end for some questions as well. We're very happy to have with us three outstanding individuals who will be our speakers tonight, in addition to Rav Buchler and to Michelle Leibowitz, who are our co-hosts. Amanda Nussbaum is a partner in the tax department and a member of the private funds group at Proskauer. She's in a practice that concentrates on planning for and structuring domestic and international private investment funds, including venture capital, buyout, real estate, hedge funds, as well as advising those funds on investment activities and operational issues. She also represents many types of investors, including tax-exempt and non-US investors with their investments in private investment funds, and most importantly, she's a proud member of the Jewish Center. Dr. Tina Lerner is the chair of the executive committee of the Jewish Communal Fund, and I recently learned is the daughter of a Jewish Center member. She is a healthcare and biotech expert who now serves as a valued advisor to a number of companies and institutions, including Board of Directors of Applied Therapeutics and the Technology Transfer Committee of the Rockefeller University. Throughout more than 2 decades on the sell and buy sides of Wall Street, Dr. Lerner served as a managing director in the equity research department of Lehman Brothers, principal at Precott Capital Management, and then founder and CEO of RX Capital Management. She was a pioneering biotech analyst and subsequently managed $1.5 billion in dedicated healthcare and biotech assets while delivering above market returns, and we're very fortunate to have her wisdom and expertise as part of our panel tonight. And finally, it's a pleasure to welcome and introduce Steve Graber. Known to many of you, Steve is a partner at Robinson Brogg in the firm's estate planning, tax, and real estate departments. His practice specializes in sophisticated estate planning, estate administration, philanthropic planning, and family business succession planning. Not only a proud Jewish Center member, but also a former president of the Jewish Center. And it's a pleasure to turn things over now to Amanda Nussbaum.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Levine. I forgot to mention that I'm a member of the TAC and former co-head of the youth department. So when you take that position, great things can happen after that. So So in the brief time we have tonight, I wanted to give a little bit of intro to charitable giving. Most of what I say, or a lot of what I say, may be familiar to you, but I'm hoping that some of what I say will be new. I titled my remarks tonight as the future looks bright, tax planning and charitable giving for a bright future. And I think this goes along with what Rabbi Levine was talking about, which is that there is a way to be doing good, but you can also do it in a way where you can do good for yourself and perhaps maximize the tax benefits. So what I'm going to talk briefly about in the next few minutes is first, what I'm sure is on everyone's mind, what do the election results mean for taxes and charitable giving? I'll speak a little bit about year-end charitable giving strategies, including donations of cash, appreciated assets, and other complex assets, and briefly compare different ways to give, whether it's giving cash to a public charity, whether it's setting up a private foundation, a DAF, and mention a few other ways of charitable giving. So first, what are the main tax benefits of charitable giving? So giving to a charity allows a donor to receive an income tax deduction. Depending on the type of charitable recipient and the type of gift, there's different limitations on the amount of your adjusted gross income you can use to offset that charitable deduction. For most people, these limits don't really come into action, but to the extent you're thinking about making a major gift in connection with a future sale of your business, where the property you're giving is a large amount, then these limits may end up coming into effect. But the good news is, even if they apply, there is a 5-year carryover. So briefly, these limits are: for cash gifts to public charities, the limit is 60% of your adjusted gross income, 30% if you're giving marketable securities or other kinds of capital gains properties. For gifts to private foundations, the deduction is generally 30% with a 20% rule for gifts of capital gain property. Under the CARES Act, which was legislation that was passed in connection with COVID this year, you actually can make a gift of up to 100% of your adjusted gross income if the gift is made to a public charity or a private operating foundation, but not a DAF. So that's something to keep in mind if you're interested in making a large gift this year. Another thing to keep in mind is if you are making a gift to a private foundation, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, then and you're gifting property other than qualified appreciated stock, generally marketable securities, then the amount of your charitable contribution deduction will be based off of the tax basis of the property, not the fair market value. And that's where giving to a DAF really has lots of advantages in being able to deduct in those situations an amount equal to the fair market value of the property you're giving rather than just the tax basis. So one should always be thoughtful in what they're giving and how they're giving. So just to use a brief example, if a donor wants to give $10,000 to a public charity and is sitting on a portfolio of stock, and that stock is now worth, $13,000, the donor could sell the stock, pay the capital gains tax, and then have $10,000 left over to make the gift and deduct that $10,000. Alternatively, the donor could gift the stock itself, still receive the $10,000 income tax deduction, but would avoid the $3,000 of capital gains. So, or could give the $13,000 full of stock and get a $13,000 deduction with no capital gains tax. So you'd be able to, by gifting appreciated property, get a deduction equal to the full fair market value, but without necessarily paying the tax. So a few brief items about tax reform. Well, none of us know what's going to actually happen, because I think the cards also have to align, right, potentially in Congress. Biden has made several proposals which could impact charitable gifts generally. So I think the first is, one of his proposals was to limit the value of itemized deductions for high earners, those making over $400,000, to 28% of the value of the gift. So right now you get a deduction that's based off of the tax rate. So current tax rate of 37%. If the tax rate goes back up to 39.6, the highest tax rate, your deduction would be based off of that 39.6% rate. If this is passed, then your deduction would only be based off of 28% rather than your actual tax rate. Biden also's plan includes an imposition of the 12.4 Social Security tax on income above 400,000. That could potentially hurt giving. Biden may revamp the 2017 tax cuts, which are scheduled to expire. And if that happens, then the amount of standard deduction will go down, which will cause a greater number of people to potentially start itemizing their taxes again and benefiting fully from a charitable deduction. There is a proposal to increase capital gains rates and also to change the estate tax, or I should say the income tax rules upon death. And that may increase potential giving of property, because if capital gains rates go up, then there is a huge benefit in donating property versus selling the property in advance and donating the cash. There also potentially may be proposals that may have a permanent idea of increasing the amount of a charitable deduction for those that don't itemize. There was a $300 deduction for those that don't itemize that was passed as part of the CARES Act. That was not available for gifts to DAFs or foundations. Charities hope that the dollar amount could be expanded, and also hope to try to get this extended in future legislation to include DAFs and private foundations. So we'll have to see in the future whether any of this legislation gets passed and what the impact of that legislation is on charitable giving. But to the extent tax rates go up, then that usually would mean that your charitable giving dollar is worth a lot more. So what are the main considerations in making charitable gifts? How do you decide? So the first is the donor needs to think about their own financial need. Do they need the cash now or property now? Or is this something where they don't need income now and they're ready to make the gift in full, besides for just the tax savings? They also need to think about timing. Do they want to make a gift now versus at the end of their lifetime? The next consideration is control. How much they want to control grant making and investment of any property that they contribute. Another factor is privacy versus recognition. Would they rather make their gift more under the radar, or they want to be recognized? And finally, flexibility. Do they want a flexible vehicle in terms of time of grounds and to get a tax contribution deduction now, versus do they not need that flexibility and are prepared to just get a contribution each year they make a gift? So a few briefly types of giving to talk about. The first is outright gifts to charity. The second is gifts to donor advised funds. The third, which we're not going to talk about tonight, would be charitable gift annuities. The fourth would be gifts to charitable remainder trusts. Both gift annuities and charitable remainder trusts could be a discussion among, could take a whole hour to discuss those. So those are other alternatives. The one thing I would mention about charitable remainder trusts is that using a mechanism like that defers income into a future year may not make sense in a potential increasing tax rate environment. So something to think about. The next category is gifts of death. And finally, included in that gifts of death, possibly using insurance as a vehicle, naming a charity as a beneficiary, or naming charities as a beneficiary as part of your 401k or other types of, retirement type plans. So first, just to talk about outright gifts of charity. Obviously, charities like that. They like cash. It's easy, get the money, get to do what they want with it. Note that even if you make an outright gift, you can potentially have some control over how the cash is or the property is being used for. For example, you can make a donation and ask for naming rights in connection with a building or a room with your gift. Also, even with outright gifts, think about contributions of complex assets, such as private securities, real estate, artwork. And there are various rules that you need to consider in connection with these gifts, outright gifts, as well as, gifts to foundations and DAFs. And this would include, if you're gifting leveraged property, you need to think about the tax impact of that. Also, if you're doing any kind of bargain type sale, these types of gifts where there's partial consideration to the donor have a different impact than if you're just donating something without any type of leverage or other type of restriction. Also need to think about in connection with contributions of property, reporting, and appraisals for property gifts over $5,000. So next category I just wanted to briefly talk about was gifts to private foundations and compare that to gifts to deaths. So a private foundation, we spoke a little bit earlier about, some of the different limitations that apply in terms of the percent of your adjusted gross income for both cash gifts and also for gifts for marketable securities, and then specifically for gifts of non-marketable securities, then the potential limitation on tax basis rather than fair market value. So moving a little bit, to talk about a DAF, a donor advised fund like JCF, and some of its advantages. A gift to a DAF is deemed for tax purposes to be a gift to a public charity. So the same 60% limitation and the same limitations on being able to deduct full fair market value on gifts of capital gain property, even if it's not marketable securities. So, and I'm sure Tina will talk about this a little bit more. The sponsoring organization chooses which charities receive donations from the DAF, but the donor advises the sponsoring organization as to which charities the donor would like the gift to be made. And in general, DAFs don't ignore the donor's advice because if they did, then no one would want to make a gift to that DAF. DAFs are often called a poor man's private foundation, even though they're used by obviously very wealthy people. And I don't mean that in a pejorative term, I mean that in a very positive term. There's no legal fees to establish it, no annual fees to maintain it. You don't have to do all of the record keeping that you would do with a private foundation. It's much easier to track your donations. You don't have to save gift receipt letters from the various public charities. DAFs don't have to meet a 5% annual distribution requirement like private foundations. They're good for clients that potentially seek privacy. And as I said, the main advantage really is on the tax rules in terms of the different limitations that apply. I think the other things that I'll just mention quickly about it is that there was very recent guidance from the IRS that changed the rules on pledges. So while pledges, generally are can't be used with a DAF, you can use them if certain rules are met, that you can still use a DAF to satisfy your charitable pledge. So for example, if the sponsoring org doesn't make a reference to the charitable pledge, the donor, doesn't try to claim a charitable contribution deduction, etc. So pledges can still be used with DAFs now in a limited way, but there are other restrictions like no split gifts that would apply. So I think in the last minute that I've had, I just wanted to briefly conclude that, charitable giving, not only allows a person to support the causes that interest them, it can provide income. We didn't touch upon it today. Maybe Steve will mention it, but also estate and gift tax savings. And unlike income tax, there aren't those same limitations for estate and gift tax purposes on charitable gifts. There are many options available. We touched on some. We mentioned trusts, private foundations, and DAFs. It makes sense to consult with an attorney or with your accountant to decide which alternative really best suits your needs. It's really important to think about these as part of your charitable giving, especially if you are thinking about selling your business, or you have property that you potentially were thinking about disposing of. You may be able to have much better tax results by donating that property to a DAF. And donors, should always speak to, their attorneys and their accountants to make sure that the tax consequences they think associated with the gift, in fact, are those tax consequences. And that comes up with us all the time. If you're giving, for example, property that potentially is leveraged, subject to a loan, the tax consequences of that gift may be different. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Tina.
Thank you. Wow. It's so amazing when somebody can distill a complex tax issue into language and concepts that we can all understand. So thank you so much, Amanda. That was great. Thanks to the Jewish Center, to Rabbi Levine and Rabbi Buchler for hosting this event. And thanks, Steve, who will be on after me, for his personal and professional insights that he's going to be sharing with you. I also wanted to acknowledge Michelle Leibowitz, who's on this call. She's a Jewish Center member. the Director of Business Development and Client Services at the JCF, and she's available during the Q&A or anytime thereafter. So now that Amanda pitched you on or explained on donor advised funds, I wanted to take this opportunity to share with you the benefits of having a donor advised fund at the Jewish Communal Fund. Now, I'm obviously very partial here because I am a 20-year fund holder at the JCF. I'm a longtime board member, and I currently have the distinct privilege of serving as the chair of the executive committee. But donor advised funds in general, DAFs, have gained a lot of traction because of the tax and other benefits. So much so that the biggest commercial retail brokerage firms, Fidelity, Vanguard, Schwab, have all become huge players in this space. And more recently, the full service brokerage firms are muscling in. But despite the heft of our competitors, I feel that donors, and in particular Jewish donors, are better served housing their charitable funds at the JCF. And it's not like we're small potatoes. The JCF is the 8th largest DAF in the country. Excluding those for-profit behemoths, we are number 4 on the non-commercial DAFs, and we're number 1, meaning the largest Jewish DAF. We have over $2 billion in charitable assets that have been entrusted to us, and it's overseen by a dedicated investment committee and outside consultants. We service donors both large and small. You could start a fund with as little as $5,000, even less for a children's fund. And at the same time, we have many donors who have placed many tens of millions of dollars in their JCF accounts. So as far as the nuts and bolts, a DAF can best be understood as a charity bank account. You deposit money or assets into the account. It's no longer yours, and it's earmarked for charity. Any charity, as long as it's an IRS qualified public charity. The beauty of this is manyfold. So you can separate the timing of the charitable deduction and the actual contribution to the charities. So maybe you had a big bonus this year, or one of your investments had a big payday in 2020. You can reduce this year's tax bill by making a very generous donation to charity before December 31st. And then with JCF, you can park the money in this charitable fund. As soon as you donate it to JCF, it counts as a charitable donation, as Amanda mentioned. And then you have time to allocate it out. I'd also say that even if this is not a year where you experience a windfall, there's still compelling reasons to give your charity through the JCF. So if you don't mind the first slide. So JCF handles all the paperwork with regard to individual charitable gifts, and they have a website to track all your gifts. Any donated funds which have not yet been granted out to a charity will sit with the JCF in a fund in your name and can be invested so that it can grow tax-free until it's granted out. If you own appreciated assets, as Amanda has just mentioned, stocks that have increased in value, you get a double benefit by donating the stock instead of the cash, as she just described, tax deduction and no capital gains. Also, by the way, it's very beneficial to you as a donor to donate securities. On the other hand, it's a pain in the neck for your favorite charity to receive those securities. It's also a pain in the neck for you to divide up your shares into crazy odd size lots if you want to donate a certain amount to each institution. So it's much more efficient. JCF will take care of all of that by efficiently converting your securities to cash, and that you ultimately will contribute, it will be recommending to contribute to cash to all your favorite organizations. Also, you can very quickly respond to crises and emergencies with charitable funds that are sitting there unspent. So for example, when the flood hit Houston, or earlier this year with COVID, I mean, JCF donors just immediately took some of that, quote unquote, idle cash that was earmarked for charity and immediately put it to good work, as well as any of the other advantages listed on this slide. So all DAFs have these advantages, but I think the JCF does it better, and it obviously does it with a Jewish flavor. We offer highly personalized service. The big financial supermarkets just can't do that. And we offer some uniquely Jewish aspects to the giving. Our menu of investment opportunities includes Israel bonds and an Israel investment fund, if donor so chooses to invest that way. We also allow donors to allocate some of their not yet granted funds to the Hebrew Free Loan Society if they so choose. And all the donations that you recommend, even to a university, a hospital, a museum, or other secular charities, will arrive as a check from the Jewish Communal Fund, underscoring that this donation is a product of Jewish values. Next slide. Here's what JCF donors in total granted out in the just completed fiscal year that ended on June 2020. Okay, I don't know if you can read all that, but it's, all the categories. We granted out over $500 million, we meaning you or the JCF fund holders, and it went into education, it went into Jewish charities, it went to a whole variety of secular charities, cultural charity, anything that you can think of. We had donors who used their JCF funds to donate. JCF maintains a huge database of vetted charities. Most of your favorite charities are probably there already, but if not, the JCF will vet a charity for you and add it to the main list. Our personal service enables donors to grant gifts to anything like the little shul on the corner, or your favorite yeshiva or day school, as well as the Metropolitan Museum of Art or Johns Hopkins University, or anything. End of slides, we don't need any more, thank you. I should also mention that all DAFs charge a fee for their service, so just to be upfront. Ours is a modest 0.75% annual fee on most accounts, which in most cases, the gains on the invested funds will more than generate enough to pay down the fee, much more. The big commercial DAFs also charge fees, and they beat us on fees, but the difference is that we donate a portion of our fees back to the Jewish community. Our organization runs lean and mean. Each year, about 20 to 30% of our fee revenue is not spent and instead donated to the UJA and to UJA-sponsored Jewish charities. We've built up a special gifts fund from these fees, from which we allocate our grants each year to local Jewish organizations. For example, recipients have been the Manhattan JCC, the Plaza Jewish Community Funeral Chapel, Mishkan Therapeutic Housing Program, and many others. In April of this year, JCF quickly mobilized $1 million from our special gifts fund to support the New York Jewish community most directly impacted by COVID. We sent out $500,000 to Met Council for food. We sent out funds for Seder meals, for services for Holocaust survivors, educational programming for seniors, and emergency cash support for single parents. So although you are paying a fee for JCF services, you can feel very good that a solid portion of that fee is going to Jewish charity as well. So I think I've given you a broad rundown. I'd be pleased to answer any questions at the end, and I'd like to turn over to Steve Graber, who can give his perspective as a professional in the field. Thank you, Steve.
Good evening, everyone. I wanted to take a step back and build on what Amanda and Tina were talking about to discuss some strategic uses of the Jewish Communal Fund and donor advised funds in general, and really talk about two different situations that I've faced as an attorney and as a family advisor. The first is what I would call philanthropic planning, and the second case that I want to talk about very briefly is legacy planning. In the first instance, where I had the good pleasure of working directly with Michelle, I was representing an individual who was a very young, early 80 years old individual. He was married at the time with a couple of children. He had been successful in life, and he was philanthropically inclined. He knew that he wanted to give away charity. He had a certain amount in mind, and it was a fairly significant amount in mind, but he didn't really know which charities that he wanted to give the assets to or when he wanted to. And as Amanda mentioned, there are certain limitations as far as the deductibility of assets that you put into a donor advised fund or that you give away in general to a charity. So in discussing this with him, I suggested a donor advised fund, which he frankly had never heard of. We set the meeting with Michelle, we met in his apartment, and we set up a plan which ended up working very nicely for him. In short, he had a number in mind that he wanted to give away to charity either during his lifetime or upon his death, actually upon the death of he and his spouse. So we set up the fund currently, and he began making gifts to the fund of appreciated securities, which as Amanda mentioned, has certain tax benefits. And he was able to calibrate his gifts so that he was able to take full advantage of it. Concurrently, in his will, he added a provision which essentially topped off the fund, so that if he wanted to leave $100 in total to charity, and he had given away $50 during his lifetime, in his will he added a provision that he would give another $50 to the charity. And that's what we did, and suffice it to say the numbers were somewhat larger, and it worked out very nicely. And the other advantage that a donor advised fund in general, and working with the fund, with the Jewish Communal Fund in specifically allows you to do, is that in the documentation that you set up, you can name successor advisors, so that just the same way in a will you would name a trustee or an executor, you can appoint your children. In this case, he had 2 children who lived in different parts of the country, and it was a way of bringing them together to fulfill the family's philanthropic needs. So really, this was really a fairly simple plan, but it was able to accomplish a number of very sophisticated needs for this individual. And it was very efficient from a tax standpoint. It was very efficient from a philanthropic standpoint. And the use of the donor advised fund, the use of and the assistance of the Jewish Communal Fund in putting this plan together was instrumental. And as I say, it worked out very, very nicely. The second case that I want to mention briefly is what I would call legacy giving. And in this case, I was working with a family that was a fairly large family. There were a number of children, grandchildren, even great-grandchildren, and they were all fairly close, but geographically diverse. The patriarch and matriarch of the family had been longtime supporters of a local school and synagogue, and they wanted to continue doing that support for years. Their other goal was they wanted to keep the family together in terms of making decisions as far as their philanthropy was concerned. So what we ended up doing was working with this was not in New York, but we worked with a local donor advised fund. And at the time, what we were able to do, and Amanda mentioned this just in passing, we funded the donor advised fund with a life insurance policy. And this was a so-called second to die life insurance, which means that the life insurance was insuring the life of both the matriarch and the patriarch, which economically makes the life insurance typically less expensive. By naming the fund as both the